How can principals create a culture of learning and growth in their schools? Hi there, I'm Stan Baker along with co-hosts Shelley Steele and Steve Young. We're retired educators who worked in Ontario in neighboring school districts using restorative practices, and now we're coaching principals in restorative practices. In this episode, our guest is Leanne Marchand, curriculum coordinator at the Chinook School Division number 211 in Saskatchewan. Leanne has a unique perspective as she's been a school principal and now she works with school principals as a curriculum coordinator. She talks about how principals can effectively support teachers and a learning community without needing to be subject matter experts.
This podcast is brought to you by the words instructional leadership. Instructional from the Latin meaning to build, arrange, or teach. Leadership comes from Old English meaning to guide or to cause to go with one. While usually associated with principals, instructional leadership is increasingly seen as a shared responsibility among teacher leaders, instructional coaches, and administrators. Research suggests that schools with distributed instructional leadership models often see greater teacher collaboration and student success.
Your feedback helps shape future discussions on restorative leadership of principals. Can you take 5 minutes to click the link in the podcast description and tell us what you think? Our website, www.restorative.ca, is for principals who deal with conflict, who want to make it right, and who want to make it about kids. If all of this is making you feel even more overwhelmed in your busy role, send me an email, stan@restorative.ca. Shelley's away this week, so let's join your hosts, Steve and me, Stan. I wanted to ask you about instructional leadership because instructional leadership is one of the roles of a principal.
Absolutely.
So how did you experience that role as a principal, and how do you help principals with their role of instructional leadership now?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's not everybody has the same comfort level in instructional leadership, but that is something that we have to take seriously as leaders and as principals. And even though we're not necessarily comfortable with every grade level or every subject area, we have to believe that we have a lot to offer. And we don't have to be expert in everything to support teachers. We just have to know how to listen and how to ask the right questions. And the only way to really get to know your teachers and get to know what's happening in our classrooms and become an instructional leader is to go into classrooms and then have great debriefing conversations with staff. I really, truly believe that. And also to do a good job with appraisals. That's not something a lot of times that just falls to the wayside and people forget, or they just do the meetings. They don't actually get into classrooms. Sometimes that happens too. But the feedback cycle is really important. And also thinking about our experienced staff, they have a right to get feedback as well. Just because we don't really have any worries about what's going on in their classroom, having the time and sitting down and reflecting on things is really key to improving your skills. So that's something that I encourage principals to do when I have an opportunity. I view my role as someone who walks beside principals. So I'm not their boss. I just help them. I do have to usher them along. And obviously, when there are initiatives that are occurring, I've been given a responsibility as well. So I have a job to do as well. So if everyone does their job and does it in a way that's hopefully as respectful and as responsive as possible, then we can get there together. So as a principal and as a vice principal, that was definitely a passion of mine, doing a good job of appraisals. And if I could, like with experienced staff, having as much choice involved as possible. Oftentimes, the way I would start appraisals with a teacher, an experienced teacher, is we would sit down with our appraisal rubric for our division. And I just asked them to come to the first meeting, having read through that and maybe highlighting some areas in that rubric that they felt like either they were really, proud of, that was going really well. And then maybe some other areas that they felt, this is somewhere like good experienced teachers know what they need to work on. And so they would come to that first meeting and we would sit down and then make some goals. And then we would set dates where I would come in. And I always asked for, okay, I'm coming in, I would like to see a lesson, you can pick it. And then at the end of the day, that same day it had to be, we would meet after school and have a debrief. And I always asked them for an hour so we could do a really good job of it. And so we laid out the year right at the beginning. And then that really helped. With newer teachers, it's a little bit different because it's a superintendent doing that appraisal in our division. But I did attend every single meeting with new teachers with the superintendent for a few reasons, but mainly to support that teacher from visit to visit, so that if a superintendent was requesting certain changes, then I had a good understanding. And sometimes new teachers don't always understand what the superintendent's really saying. And so I feel like that helps me understand what's happening and support. We have a debrief after the debrief. Okay, and this is what the superintendent's asking you to do. How can we help you get there? As a coordinator, one of the things that I've been trying in the last couple years is going out and working with literacy teams. I call it literacy action planning. And I make a visit, like I ask, like I do 10 schools per year essentially. And we set up a K-5 meeting, and the principal is there and the interventionist, and we talk about students, because sometimes I find that principals don't know how to talk about data. So modeling and being part of that, and like showing them how, like their role in it. It's not necessarily, they might not have the answers about what could work for that one student, but they then understand the implications in terms of, but this group is going to need some support. What does that mean for my scheduling? What does it mean for student services, or maybe putting EAs in certain areas? Or so that way that support is there and they understand the rationale. Yeah, that's another thing that I've done that I feel has worked.
I wanted to ask, principals are busy people, and you are busy as a principal too. Where do principals find the time to have these debrief and reflective conversations with you, and how does that work exactly?
That's, I guess, if student results are a priority, then to me, like that was how we did things in a division. Like we have a data-based, everyone enters data twice a year for K-3 in literacy, and we expect some type of intervention to be happening in each school. So what I see is that if you're really wanting to focus on the needs that are there, if you really want to make things happen for your kids, and I believe every principal wants their students to succeed, then you're going to want to be smart with how you use that time or how you strategically improve results. And the only way to do that is to sit down with your team and talk about the kids and say, okay, where are our kids here? And you can do that in big schools too. When I was at Centennial, we had 500 students. So that was K-8. And so we had an Excel sheet and we kept track. And so if you have intervention time, you have student services teachers, you have people that can work with those kids, then I feel like that's really important, because otherwise it's just, you have no idea how that time's being used, and it's just kids cycling through, or it's always the same students getting intervention. So in order to be responsive, you should meet 3 or 4 times a year. And it's going to be different for every school. So when I go out, I say, okay, what are the natural times that you as a school make decisions around who gets supports, or when you might be doing some goal setting around students? And they tell me, we usually do it, we want to have it before parent conferences. Or some of them say, no, I want it right after report cards because we'll have fresh data. So everybody has a different timelines, and that's okay. What you don't want though is for your interventions to stay static all year long, because then you're not really utilizing your time as you should. So in our division, It's not always well received. It's just, but by the end of the year, people appreciate the process. Yeah. I try to make it as close to kids as possible so that the time that we use is valued. It's not about them, it's about let's take a look at your kids and let's talk about. And most teachers want to talk about their students and why they're not learning. And they want someone to be able to give them ideas as to what they can try next. So making that time is really important.
As a principal, we've always been told we're curriculum leaders. We're the leaders of the curriculum in the school, and there's no questioning that. But we also recognize that there's a lot of what we call management tasks that have to take place by principals throughout the year. And sometimes the overload seems to be on the management side rather than the curriculum leadership side, to the point where there's a lot of frustration among principals that they can't do more with curriculum because they're so busy doing all these other things. As a principal, I'm sure you ran across that yourself personally. Geez, I'm just so busy doing all this, I haven't got time for that. But now as the curriculum leader who's tasked to go into those schools, do you run across that with principals who are almost, I'll say, balking at doing the work because they just don't seem to have the time? And how do you manage that with that group so that ultimately you do get the work done with a one or two or a group who are saying we don't have the time for it right now?
I guess I don't really have principals that don't want to do it. It's more like they think, why do I have to be there? Like, why can't you just tell the student services people to do it? But to me, when you do that, then you're putting a lot of responsibility on a student services teacher, for example, or an interventionist to make all those decisions. So ultimately, you're putting that person in a role where they are at risk for getting peppered by all the teachers around them, and they have to make decisions that they often don't feel comfortable making. So sometimes I have to explain some of the rationale behind why it's important for the principal to be there. And the other thing is oftentimes we're talking about resources that are needed or problem solving around timetabling, and some of those things can't be decided if the principal is not at the table. So I have to explain, and oftentimes what I'll do is I'll write up like the plan for the year and I'll give it to them in June so they have time to think about it, they have time to front load their staff. So if you're doing this kind of process or you want to start something like this as a principal, you front load your staff, you explain the rationale multiple times, you explain what's going to happen, and then you set that time aside way in advance. And then if based on what you think you and your staff can handle, it might be half an hour every 2 weeks, or it might be a morning meeting, it might be a lunch meeting. So finding the time that works for your staff is really important. And then just sticking to it, because the more you do it, the more efficient it becomes. And then it's just the way we do things. So that's what you want to get to. You want to get to that point. But I hear what you're saying. It's not easy. And sometimes you'll have to cancel, but ideally that is like sacred time. So you want to pick a time of day and a time of the week, or if it's Monday morning and you have to free up certain people because that's who you're going to meet with, then do that when there's been no discipline yet. So figuring out, being creative, it does help. Or even if it's this year, we're going to spend the last 15 minutes of the staff meeting, and that's where we're going to use, and I'm going to meet so they already know, so you're not actually adding more time to the schedule, you're just being creative.
I was hearing it's very restorative in the approach that you're taking, right? With the listening, and you're asking questions to have people drive the conversation and then supporting that way. But you're also setting expectations that this will happen. But let's say, how can I support you to make this happen, right? So that it's not an option. And that's a very restorative way to be a leader, for sure, that we need this to happen. It will happen. So how are we going to make it happen? And then you listen, and then you move from there.
Sometimes It hurts at the beginning, but if you've decided as a principal, you have to stick with it, because for some people, they're going to sit back and wait to see the value. And if you
Right.
quit too early, then you're in a cycle. Then they're like, okay, if I just be resistant next time, I'll never have to do it.
How do you actually address the challenges as a principal as you manage curriculum leadership alongside operational demands? As Leanne points out, it's about reflective conversation and continuous feedback to foster professional growth. It's how principals can use student data to inform what teachers do in terms of their instructional strategies, interventions, and resource allocation. I love what she said. It's not about teaching practice, it's about student learning. And we're not stopping at this conversation. We want your perspective and what resonated with you and what challenges do you face in developing a learning community in your school. Take 5 minutes to share your thoughts. The link is in the podcast description. Leading instruction is something that often gets put on the back burner with all the busy management that's done day to day in schools. Use the student data, and if this still seems overwhelming to you, I can help. So email me, stan@restorative.ca.